Wait, After Effects is not really a design program, right? You got Illustrator and Photoshop, and can you actually draw beautiful stuff directly in After Effects? Stick around, find out. Let's go! As far as the individual controls of a shape goes, they are down here in the timeline. So we have a shape layer called shape layer 1 with contents, and it has rectangle 1. In that we have rectangle path, and for the rectangle path what we have is the size, which we can unlink the proportions or keep them linked. We can change the position of the shape itself, and we can change the roundness. These are the settings available within the rectangle shape. So if we just delete that one and move up here again and click and hold, you will see the other shapes available in this menu. So we have a rounded rectangle, ellipse, polygon tool, star tool. If I just use the star tool and draw a star, you'll see that that is what you get. But when we move down here, in the polystar path 1, we have a bunch of other settings that we didn't have for the rectangle because this shape is a little bit more complex, and we could do things like change the points to be 10 points. We can change the inner radius, we can change the outer radius, the inner roundness, or the outer roundness. So what was once a star has now turned into some sort of a groovy flower shape. What we can also do is change the type from star to polygon. So what we saw up here, polygon and star, are actually the same thing. And if you don't want to use one of the starting shapes to start with, you can use the pen tool, and we have that right here. The pen tool works the same way as it does in Illustrator or Photoshop and any other program really that has a pen tool, where you can draw a shape like this, and you have the points that you can move around and do whatever you want with it. So you can have a fill or a stroke. In this case, I've just drawn a jagged line, so I could choose to turn off the fill, just have a stroke. I can still modify the way that this line works. And what I did was I just took my pen tool and I clicked to create these points. That is why they have these sharp corners. But if I go up here and I click and hold, it's the add or delete vertex tool, but I can also convert vertex tool. So if I click and drag on this point, you'll see now I get these familiar Bezier handles. And that means that I can change the shape of the curvature of the thing that I have created. So I have a lot of control over the line like this. That is why After Effects really is a very powerful design tool, where you don't have to venture off into Photoshop, Illustrator, or a different program, and can do a lot of the work directly within After Effects. So we're in Adobe Photoshop, and we're not here because we're supposed to design the thing in Photoshop. We will be doing all of that in After Effects, but what we're here to do is use Photoshop as a little bit of a brainstorming tool, just to sketch out what we're going to be doing and what we can think about. The body of the spaceship would be shaped kind of like this, right? Like an almond type shape, and then you would have some sort of a glass dome up here with a little bit of a highlight to show that it's glass. Then maybe we want to go ahead and have some sort of a line or a shadow down here to indicate a little bit of a more 3D type shape. So this area would be darker. What else we want to add is like a hole down here where they can beam up whatever people they want to abduct.
Little fucking Martians.
So we'd have a hole here with a little bit of a 3D
you gotta love them,
angle, so it looks like a hole. That's going to be black in there. Here they can beam up people. Just draw a little dude here. And maybe we want to add like a row of lights here. Let's say that this is sort of what we're going for with our spaceship. I already have a comp 1 here that's 1920 by 1080. But what I like to do is actually design all of my assets in a higher resolution than the final output of the video. So the standard resolution that I typically go for is to create a new composition, and I will create that as 3000 by 3000. So again, that's much bigger than 1920 by 1080, and this is because I want to be able to scale up and down my assets as separate compositions. If I have this layer in my composition and I just want to make sure that when I'm rendering this final video, if this layer is still here and I forget to delete it or just turn off the eyeball over here, if I forget to do that, I can actually set this layer. If I go to layer and change it to a guide layer, that's going to add a little blue grid shape here, and that means that this layer will never show up in the final render. So that's a good little safety precaution just to think about. With that, let's get into designing our spaceship. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the body shape. So this big almond looking thing right here. What I could do is I could take the pen tool and I could just click over here. I could click and drag over here. I could click and drag over here, click and drag over here. And I could try to get a shape that looks kind of similar to this one. But if I'm not really that comfortable working with the pen tool and I'm having a hard time getting the curves right here, I can actually use the shape layers to my advantage to be able to design something like this in a much more clever way in After Effects. So let's have a look at how we do that. I'm just gonna click and click and click and click and click to close up the shape. And then I'm gonna change the color to be some sort of a grayish color, and I'm gonna take out the stroke, or let's keep the stroke, but let's make it black and make it much thinner. So we have a black outline, and it's not looking like much at the moment, but we can actually use the shape layer capabilities to simplify the design process of shapes like this. So I'm going to name this layer to be my body. I'm going to open it up down here in the timeline and open up the contents. And you'll see the secret little add menu up here. If you click on that arrow, you're greeted with a little menu of things. And I'm not actually sure what these are called in After Effects. I like to think of them as shape layer modifiers. So they allow you to modify the shape. And the one that I would like to use right now is the one called round corners. So if I just click on that one, you'll see round corners have been added. And if I open that up, you have a radius. So if I just turn that up, you'll start to see what happens. The 4 corners that we did have now been rounded, and we're able to change this even throughout the design process. So we never have to commit to exactly what we want it to look like. And looking at my sketch here, you'll see that yes, it is rounded at the top and bottom, but the left and right corners are a little bit sharper than they are on the top and bottom. I just have one radius. I can't really control those corners individually, but what I can do is I can go with my pen tool and just hover on the line over here until I see a little plus icon, and then I can just click, and I can click to add another one. I can do the same thing over here. So really, I'm just adding more points to this shape, and that means that this corner is going to be sharper because there are more points. They're still being rounded, but there are more points closer to each other, so they're not being rounded as much. What we'll focus on next is the glass orb at the top. And for that, I want to use a rounded rectangle. So I don't want to draw this by hand. Instead, I'll go up here and use the rounded rectangle. I'm just going to double click that so it creates a shape the size of my composition with the anchor point in the middle. I can then open that up, and let's change this to maybe 1000 by 1000. Just turn up the roundness. Maybe we want to do, it could be a little bit wider or a little bit taller. It doesn't have to be a constrained proportion circle. It can be more of a pill shape, really, like we have in the sketch up here. So we'll do a pill shape kind of like this. Take my rectangle tool, and I'll just draw a rectangle like this, covering the area that I don't want to see. And just to make this super obvious, I will turn that one to be red. So what I want to do now is I want to use the red rectangle as a mask for the top part. Luckily, After Effects has such a tool. So in the timeline down here, we have rectangle 1 and we have rectangle 2. So to make sure that we know which is which, I'm going to name rectangle 1 to be glass dome. Rectangle 2, I'm going to name that to be mask. With none of these selected, just selecting the name, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to select add and I'm going to choose the one called merge path. And what happens now is that these are going to be merged together, which is not technically what we want at the moment, but we're using the right tool to create the thing that we want to create. So I'll go over to the merge path and I'll open that up. And in here we have a mode switch and it's set to add, which means that it's merging the two shapes together. We have a couple other options. We have merge, subtract, intersect, exclude intersections. In this case, what I want to do is I want to subtract. And we are subtracting, but we're doing it in the wrong order. So what we need to do to fix this issue is just to take the mask layer here in the contents and move that below the glass dome. And there we go. So what's happening here is that we're taking the glass dome, we're using a merge path to subtract the mask, which is the bottom rectangle, from that glass dome. So now we're only showing the upper part. And when I take the glass dome and move this around, you will see exactly how this works. So I'm just going to Command C that and get that back to normal. And after the merge path, a new stroke and a new fill is added. So I can just select the entire layer. Then I can change the fill color to be that light blue again. And with that, we have a glass dome. And the next step that we want to add is the hole at the bottom. And to do that, I will be using an ellipse tool. So it's going to be a circle, but it's going to be sort of squashed to make it look like it's a little bit more rotated in 3D space. So again, I'll go up here and I'll go to my ellipse tool. I'll just double click that to create an ellipse. And we're going to scale that way down to maybe 500 by 500. I'm just going to move the layer down here. And to make what we're looking at make sense, I'm just going to click the fill color and then use the eyedropper to select the color of the body. And from there, just darken it down a little bit more. So now what we want to do is unconstrain those proportions and then squash down the height. And when I move it down here, now it's starting to look more and more like a hole that we're seeing from a little bit of a 3D space. I use my pen tool and I'm just going to click over here and click in the middle and click and hold to be able to adjust that shape a little bit more. And then click out here. And then I'm just going to cover the bottom half kind of like this. And for this one, I don't really need a stroke, so I'm going to turn that off. And what I do want is to have a completely black fill. So this is going to act as our shadow, and I'll name this layer shadow. If I hit T on my keyboard to get the transparency, or opacity as it's called, I can just lower the opacity and you'll see that now we're getting a bit of shading down here. What we're also getting is a shadow that's covering the lower half of the composition. And if we turn on our good old transparency grid here, and I just turn up that opacity again, you'll see that the shadow is actually covering everything, not just the layer. And this is one of the main benefits of designing all of your individual assets in their individual compositions. Because what we can do now is use this little secret button down here, the little T that says preserve underlying transparency. And with this magic button, you're going to see what happens. Boom. So what's happening here is that the layer, which I have selected right now called the shadow, is only being shown when there is an alpha channel below it. So if you remember back to the original first lesson of the basics of After Effects, we looked in the info panel, which shows us the RGB values wherever the mouse is hovering. And the A stands for alpha, or where a layer is transparent or not. And now we have our shadow just inside of the layers that we already had created. I can turn down the opacity back down to, let's say, 20%. And right now we only have a shadow inside of the layer here, which is exactly what we were after. So everything is all good. All right, we got the shadow down. Next step is adding that little highlight to the glass dome. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the glass dome. So I'm going to select that layer and hit Command D or Control D on PC. And that's going to be called Glass Dome 2. Just going to rename that to Glass Dome Highlight. And if I click the little circle over here, I will be able to solo that layer. So now I'm only looking at this layer called glass dome highlight, and all the other layers are currently hidden. So let's think about this. What would we want a highlight to look like? Well, if we bring up our sketch again and just turn up the opacity, you'll see that what I have is a little line and then an even smaller line, just covering the sort of left upper half of the glass dome. I'm gonna select that layer and just turn off the fill because I don't need it, and just turn on the stroke and turn that to be white. I'm gonna turn off the transparency grid, and I'm actually gonna lower the opacity of the sketch up here so it's not in the way, and solo the glass dome as well. So now we're looking at these 3 layers only. So on the glass dome highlight, if I open that up and go into the contents, you'll see the exact same structure as we had before. So we have the glass dome at the top, we have our mask at the bottom, which we kind of don't really need at all in this example, but we'll keep it for now. In the glass dome, I'll open that up where I have a rectangle path, and I'll open that up. And here I have my size controls. So what I can do is I can just adjust the size of this one. So I'm getting a stroke here. I'm actually getting a white stroke all the way around, but what I'm looking at right now is this upper corner and seeing, is that the type of highlight that I'm after? And maybe it is, but I want to update the stroke width to be a little bit higher. So it's a thicker stroke for the highlight. So maybe let's go for 75. And what we can do is we can actually just get rid of all of the mask. So the mask, the merge path, and the stroke. Let's just delete those to keep things simple, and the fill at the bottom. There we go. So now we only have the glass dome, and now you see that it's also showing the lower half, but that really doesn't matter at this point. So to get the look that we're going for with this one, again, we want to dive into the shape layer modifiers. So we go to the little add icon over here, click on that, and here we have one called trim path, which is going to be our friend for a lot of things going forward in After Effects. This is something I use a whole lot of for designing stuff, but also animating stuff, and you'll see why in just a second. So let me add a trim path, and I'll open that up, and here we have a start, end, and offset value. So the start is set to 0, the end is set to 100, and when I start to change these values, you will see that it's actually trimming this path, and that's why it's called the thing it's called. So I can just fudge around with the numbers a bit and try to get a highlight which is kind of the length that I want it to be. And then using the offset, I can just spin that around to always adjust the positioning of how I want it to be. So we're going to do something like that. I'm going to change the start to be a little bit less, something like that. And if I just zoom in here and look at my sketch again, I just drew this with a rounded pen tool, and right here I have a very sharp corner. And go to the stroke parameter, which is what we have. We have a white stroke. We'll open that up, and here we have something called line cap. This is currently set to butt cap. So if I change that to round cap instead, you will see that now I have some nice looking rounded corners on that highlight. So now I have line number 1. To get line number 2, what I would do is I would just duplicate this layer, call that glass dome highlight 2 is fine. Then I'll go back into the trim path, and I'll just change the offset and move it down a bit, and then I can change the numbers so that this is going to be a much smaller line like that, and then move it back up with the offset. And now we have a highlight that's going to be very similar to the way that the highlight here looks. I will just use my pen tool and draw a bit of a cone shape. I'll just click and drag up here and try to match that shape. Click over there, click over there, click over there. And then let's just change that to be a lightish yellow. We'll turn off the stroke, and we will just hit T and turn down the opacity, just so we have something to look at. Again, we'll replace that layer completely in the next video. So I'm just going to name that to be beam. So how do we go about creating those lights? Well, just like everything in After Effects, because it is this Swiss Army knife of software, there's going to be a million different ways to do everything that you want to do. So there's very rarely going to be a right or wrong answer. Just to get some lights in there, what I will do is I'll go up to the rounded rectangle tool again, double click that and get a big square, and I'll just size that down to, let's say, 100 by 100, something like that. And I'll just select the whole layer and move that somewhere over here-ish. And I'll just add a black stroke to that one as well. Add 20 pixels, just like the rest, and turn up the roundness, so it's going to be a circle. I'll actually make that even smaller, maybe 50. And we'll turn the stroke down to 10 or something, just so it's not too big. So just to keep track of what I'm doing, I'm going to name this one lights. And again, we're diving into the shape modifiers menu. So I'm going to click add. And here I'm selecting one called repeater, which is going to be pretty straightforward in what it does. It's going to be repeating the shape. So we're getting 2 more copies right now. The reason we're getting 2 more copies is because in the repeater, the copies are going to be set to 3 by default. So I'll just change that to 15 or to 20 or even more, 30, just to cover the entire spaceship. And I'll just take the entire layer and move that somewhere over here, let's say. So now we have our shapes repeating, and there are settings in here for the repeater to change how it's repeating. Right now, if you open up the transform repeater, you'll see that we have position, and it's going to be set to 100 on X by default. So it's moving these copies 100 pixels to the right. I can also move them to the left, or I can move them up. And there are settings in here to change the rotation, and I can change the position. I can change the opacity. There's a bunch of stuff that I can do, but it's not really super straightforward to have it going in an arc across the body of the spaceship like this. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reset everything that I did. So I have it moving 100 pixels to the right. And now I'm actually going to use a technique that we'll be diving much deeper into in the composition video. I'm going to be creating a pre-composition using these lights. So with the lights layer selected, I'm going to hit Command-Shift-C, and that's going to bring up the pre-compose window. I'll just name this composition. It can be named lights, that's fine. I'm going to move all attributes into new composition. And when I click OK now, you'll see that the icon has been replaced. The color of the layer has also been replaced. And all of a sudden we have a thing up here called lights in the project window. And that's because we've taken our shape layer with the repeater and transformed that into a pre-composition. So if I double click this one, we're getting a 3000 by 3000 sized comp with the lights in the exact same place that they just were. We have our shape layer here. We can still make changes to the repeater or to the shape or whatever we want. But in our spaceship composition, we just have a single layer now that is a pre-composition with all of these lights. So the reason I want to have it as a pre-composition is because I want to use something called the puppet tool. And that one can be found up here. So here we have the puppet position pin tool. If I click on that one, I will get a puppet pin icon here. And I can use that to click on this one over here. And maybe I click on the one in the middle. And then I click on the one over here. And now if I hover over the one in the middle and I move that up, I can just move my entire range of lights to warp as if they're going up. Or actually, I can't. And the reason why I can't do that is because even though it's a pre-composition, the puppet pin tool still sees that there is an empty space between all of these lights, and it's not seeing it as one connected composition. So if I just solo this layer, you'll see that we have all of these holes between the lights. And again, this is made even more clearly by the transparency grid. So what I want to do is I want to create a puppet pin here, one over here, and one in the middle, and then be able to warp the entire chain of lights. But that's not the result that I'm getting. So let's figure out, how do we actually turn this into the way that we want After Effects to behave? And the answer is a little bit of a weird way of having to work, but that's just the way that After Effects is going to handle this. So I'm going to select the word puppet over here and just click delete. And I will double click my lights composition. That opens it up in the timeline, so I'm now inside of my lights composition. And the secret hacky way of getting this to work, the way that you maybe expect it to work, is just to fill in the blank spaces between the lights. So After Effects will see this as one long rectangle instead. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing. We're going to go up here and use the rectangle tool, and just to be able to see what we're doing a bit easier, I'm going to use a red fill and no stroke, and I'm just going to draw a rectangle that covers all of these lights. And I'll just move that to the bottom, and we can name that layer just to make sure we're doing our job correctly. And name that rectangle, and that's it. So I'll move back to my composition, and if I unsolo the lights, you'll see that, now we see this big red rectangle. That's not going to be there for very long, but it's going to be there for now once we're working with the puppet pin tool. So I'll go back up to the puppet position tool, and I'll click on this light, same as before. I'll click on the middle light, same as before, and I'll click on this light, same as before. When I now go back and I click and drag on this middle one, you're going to see that now it's acting like one big rectangular shape, and I can move these points around and sort of warp the path that these lights are positioned on. And when I have that fixed, when I have my puppet pins created while having this red rectangle turned on, all I need to do is go back in here and turn off the eyeball, because the puppet pin tool still recognizes the fact that it was there when the puppet pins were created. So whenever I move my points around now, I am actually getting the correct result that I was expecting to get. And I can move my stuff around and get whatever kind of light positioning that I'm after. We have our basic spaceship in place, and in the upcoming video we're talking about effects, and in that one we're still using this spaceship as our foundation, but we're sort of upgrading it and making it even more exciting, using a bunch of effects to not only animate it but also up the design of the spaceship, and that's going to be really cool. Well. Might not be the Mona Lisa, but we got something designed that is actually already built for animation. Instead of doing it in a separate program, then bringing it in, then having to rework a bunch of stuff, you can actually create a lot of really cool illustrations directly in After Effects. So where do we go from here? Well, we talked about shape layers, but there's a little bit of another category that we're going to dive into next, and that one is called effects. So click the link for the next one, or hit the like, hit the subscribe, stick around, learn a bunch of cool stuff.
Perfect!